Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm losing my sense of time. And salam alaikum. It's nice to see so many people. Some of you I know from other contexts and are friends of the Institute, of me, of other contexts. Some I'm meeting for the first time. And thank you, Dr. Hashmi, for the lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was hoping to get here a little earlier, but I took the wrong turn off on the highway, and then I got stuck in this crazy traffic. So my apologies for missing the earlier session. But today we're going to be talking about the continued theme here on Islamophobia in higher education, and I'm really delighted to introduce our panel. What we'll be doing is we'll work in order, going from the farthest right to my most immediate right. And so we'll start with Amira Elghawaby, Faisal, Bhabha, and Umberin as well. And so but before we do that, let me first introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to hand the mic over to them. So, to my far right, Amira Elghawaby is a journalist, human rights advocate, and is a contributing columnist for the Toronto Star. She's a frequent media commentator on equity, inclusion, and delivers a variety of presentations, keynote and otherwise, and to different audiences. She currently leads the strategic communications and campaigns at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. She's previously worked for the labor movement in communications and human rights, and also spent 5 years working at the Canadian on civil liberties for Canadian Muslims at the National Council of Canadian Muslims from 2012 to 2017. To her left is Faisal Bhabha, friend and colleague as well. I should say that Amira has, in recent years, become a friend. I've also really very much appreciated the way you locate your voice and the way you also interrogate sites of civil liberties concerns and the way you think about these issues from the perspective of those who bring a certain lived reality to it, but also the way governments react or don't react, and the way of navigating that space is something that I've long been impressed with. So it's a real pleasure to have you here. Faisal Bhabha, colleague and friend, associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School. He does a number of things. He's a faculty director of the Canadian Common Law LLM degree program. He researches extensively in constitutional law, multiculturalism, law and religion, national security. He also advocates in that context. As well. And so he has his own law practice where he has done some really impressive litigation in this area, and I'll leave it to him to talk to you about that. I also want to make a note on a personal level. He recently had me and my colleague David Schneiderman at Osgoode and did a wonderful job. Really just the hospitality and generosity you had. Thank you very much for that, and it was a wonderful experience. Umberin Najeeb. This is my first time meeting Dr. Najeeb. She's at U of T along with me. It's a pleasure to meet you. Associate Professor of Medicine and the faculty lead on equity, as well as the co-director of the Master in Teacher Program Department of Medicine at U of T. She is a staff internist at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center, a graduate of Khyber Medical College at the University of Peshawar in Pakistan, and a graduate of U of T's Internal Medicine Residency Program. She's a fellow of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Pakistan and Royal Colleges of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amira. Is that mic working? Do we know? It is. So I'm going to put this down.
Okay, bismillah. Hello, assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. So lovely to see you all here. It is an absolute honor to be here on the territory of the Huron-Wendat and First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I want to thank Shahna for reaching out and being very convincing of why I should come and have the honor and privilege to be here with this incredible panel. To see Professor Emon is always a pleasure, and the work that he has done and with all of the research and history around Muslims in Canada has been really very inspiring. So it's good to be in company such as this. So where I just want to kind of start my talk today is around thinking about institutions of higher learning and how we hold them accountable for all of the promises and commitments that are being made around equity and inclusion. And so it's been many years since I've been in a university setting as a student. I still occasionally am invited to speak to classes, and I had spent quite a bit of time while I was at the National Council of Canadian Muslims dealing with human rights complaints that were coming at us from various parts of our society, including from universities. And so I remember, oftentimes the biggest struggle that people are facing when they're trying to get attention to how they are being discriminated against, whether it's the way they're being treated in a classroom, the way that they are being dismissed, the way they feel that differential treatment, that negativity, and their inability to navigate systems that are often opaque, that are often not welcoming of their concerns, and they just face barrier after barrier. And so while we have seen a constant sort of push from people within these institutions to try to make change, and through all of the different ways that awareness has been growing around Indigenous sovereignty, around colonial practices and white supremacy, all of these sort of trends and discussions that have been growing, we continuously hear, oh, there are all of these new commitments and new funding being put into place to address equity, but at the end of the day, the constant issue is that accountability and transparency piece. So I'll give an example that I feel kind of shows what I mean. Last year, I had come across a situation at Memorial University of Newfoundland that I was reading about. And some of you may know this story. There had been a group of medical students, many of them who are Muslim, who had come across some posts by a second-year medical resident who had been posting anti-Black posts. He had been being disparaging about Indigenous communities. He was being racist about other communities, as well as Islamophobic. In fact, he described himself in one of his posts as an Islamophobe. And so a group of these medical students wrote a letter to the university's dean, the dean of the Faculty of Medicine, to complain about how they were very concerned for obvious reasons. Now, the issue that came in this particular case is, as I said, one of the constant issues is that the university, while acknowledged that obviously this is not correct, and said that they were going to there were going to be consequences, this individual had to take what was called a quote-unquote tailor-made academic remediation program by the school's training committee. There was actually no transparency as what does that actually mean? How do people have confidence in something that is supposed to be addressing these very real concerns when they don't actually know what is involved in that remedial training? And not only that, but the students who had complained themselves were told that they may be themselves subject to a counter-investigation. And so the chill effect that that created on these students who are worried that they themselves would be investigated as whistleblowers in that counter-complaint. And so even the advocacy chair for the Canadian Women in Medicine and a physician herself, Dr. Michelle Cohen, had spoken about how difficult it was to get the administration to provide any actual details about how this resident was going to be treated, what exactly were the consequences, and other issues that her organization had raised about the student would always be met with boilerplate responses. Again, no substantive information and no actual assurances to the community. And this is what's often sort of missed, I think, by university administrators or in any other institutions, that when you have a situation where people are deeply concerned about discrimination from someone who is in a position of potential power, and they are not being assured that this is going to be addressed adequately, that it creates a chill in the entire institution and within that particular community that's been targeted. So another doctor, Dr. Tariq Lubani, out of London, Ontario, who had been helping these students, said that this case really does demonstrate why there's oftentimes a lack of confidence in medical profession, that within, for instance, the medical profession and that teaching community, that there's no accountability to physicians who may be bringing in serious biases that can eventually harm people's outcomes in the medical treatment. So I use that story just again to reinforce how all the lip service in the world will not actually address the root causes or root issues. And so when we think about individual Islamophobia, if someone is being offensive or what have you, or outright racist, even where there are mechanisms to take that person and make them accountable, if there isn't more deep systemic change that's demonstrated and specifically spelled out to that community that's been harmed, then there is no confidence. Confidence is shaken, and particularly when the very people who've brought forward these concerns, which takes a lot of courage, and a lot of times it's actually at the real risk that these students were going to harm their own advancement within the school, that there is then that chill, and so people are unable to continue. The other area that I also want to talk about, and probably we'll talk more when we go in a bit deeper into the discussion, is even when it comes to that individual harassment or outright discrimination or even potential violence that may happen, whether on university campuses or elsewhere, what we have found at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, where I work currently, is that supports for victims of hate are so slim right across Canada and really are a hodgepodge. And so university campuses as well are a microcosm of that broader space. And so when we're thinking about systemic change, absolutely necessary, but it also means how are systems responding to the potential victimization of the folks that are in this campus setting. And as we have found, because the supports are so hodgepodge, there is no consistency in the broader community, let alone in university campuses. This is also very potentially detrimental to the well-being of faculty, of staff, and of students who are on these university campuses. And hate crimes themselves are considered message crimes, because similar to the discrimination that I described, they are sending a message not only to the person who is specifically targeted in that instance, but to that entire community that will hear and learn and be oftentimes traumatized by what has been happening in that targeted attack on someone. I want to keep going, but I do feel that I'm going to let others speak, and then through the Q&A, I'll be able to address a little bit more. So I'll pass it over.
Thank you very much. Dr. Najeeb asked actually if she could reorder the queue a little bit, because her remarks are going to naturally flow from yours, Amira. So we, with the permission of Faisal Bhabha, we're going to slightly reorder the order. So Dr. Najeeb, the floor is yours.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. As you can see, I'm not a religious scholar. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a practicing physician. I'm an internist at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center. My context is medical education. I'm an educator and associate professor of medicine. And as I was listening to Noor's comedy, I kind of modified what I was going to say here as well. So bear with me. I'm going to go from a narrative perspective, like how does, so I identify myself as a Pakistani-born Canadian Muslim woman. I moved to Canada in 2004. And I do identify that, apart from motherhood, as one of the life-altering experiences in my life, because I had to make changes as a person, acculturate myself in Canada, and also make changes. And also need to recertify myself as a healthcare provider. You know, it's very tough to be a doctor here in Canada if you're coming from another part of the world. So a lot of exams and a lot of redoing some accelerated residency program. And why am I telling you all this? I think we all have our unique social identities, and we all have our unique life experiences. And what do we do with that, regardless of what our profession is or whatever we decide to do in our life? It's very important. So I have purposefully decided to use my voice and lived experiences to mitigate racism, discrimination in medical education. And Islamophobia got, I was not looking for more work. I'm already an equity lead for the Department of Medicine. I run a 2-year certificate course called the Master Teacher Program for Faculty Development. I'm a faculty lead for International Medical Graduates IMG Mentorship Program. So I was definitely not looking for the work, but what happened in the spring and early summer of last year, specifically in University of Toronto and the Middle Eastern crisis, which started the conversation, or rather a lot of hate comments and discriminatory comments, and a lot of uncomfortable and a lot of, I would say, creating alienation in the community of medical education around anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So I don't use that title in my signatures, and I didn't even send it to Shena, but I'm the senior advisor on Islamophobia for the Temetry Faculty of Medicine. And I think that's the particular reason I'm invited here to this panel. What I've learned over the course of last 1.5 years is that we have forgotten how to disagree with each other, how to agree to disagree with each other in a respectful manner. We all have different values, belief system. We even vote, like Noor was talking about who did she vote for. We all vote for different people, but we get one prime minister, who is our prime minister for 4 years, and then we get another election. And sometimes we start painting things and describing our own opinions as suggestive of the whole nation or a whole religion. And I'm talking in a very broader spectrum here, and I'm going to share a few examples. So my context is health professions education. I'm an educator, as I said before, so more from a curriculum design, program development, mentorship, and faculty development. And one thing which has become very clear is that many times things which we are labeling as anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or other form of religious discrimination has nothing to do with religion. That's another piece as well. That's a human rights issue or a human rights or healthcare crisis kind of situation. So one thing which has been very apparent in University of Toronto and especially in Temetry Faculty of Medicine for years and years is that many of the learners, they were not able to go into operating room because of their religious attire. So I keep on listening from, I don't wear hijab, I see a lot of hijab wearing women sitting beside me and also in the audience as well. My daughter wears hijab, independently chose to wear hijab in grade 10. So I can understand the challenges which a hijab wearing women face in learning environments and in general community. So coming back to the example which I'm sharing is that many of the hijab-wearing medical students were told, you can't go to an operating room. Oh, what are you going to do about this? Like preceptors were telling them, circling their hijabs as well. And then I realized that this is not just an issue for Muslim hijab-wearing women, it's what about the people wearing Jewish women or a turban-wearing Sikh person? So, and that led to the initiative of, there was a lot of discriminatory behaviors which learners faced in the medical education realm as well. And this led to the development, which should have done many, many years ago, the standards of religious attire accommodation in sterile spaces. It took me a year, a lot of patience and perseverance, but finally, after 10, 12 years, finally, University of Toronto Academic Health Sciences Network has a document which empower learners on how to accommodate religious attire in sterile spaces without compromising patient care, because patient safety is always our priority as well. And the second reason I purposefully chose this example is because how can we bring people together? If it's all about me, but if the same situation which I'm experiencing, others are also facing, how can we have a constructive conversation about it? So that brings up a lot of cohesiveness to the conversation around how can we support our learners, our peers, our colleagues from a religious discrimination perspective. One thing more I want to add is that there's a lot of fear among Muslim community. Some is overt and some is covert, and I think it's no surprise since 9/11 we are living in a different kind of world where openly acknowledging your religious identity or your religious affiliation can lead to repercussions. People are scared on how they're going to be perceived by their peers, by their communities, by their departments, by their divisions as well. So how can we change the culture where everybody is proud and saying their social identities, regardless of whatever religious discrimination is? It took a lot of courage for Noor to say so. I'm an immigrant, I was born in Jordan, I'm this and I'm that, and she's telling us all jokes about her dating history as well. But the way I identify myself as a Pakistani-born Canadian Muslim woman, we need to empower our learners, our colleagues, our peers, and change the culture that everybody can openly acknowledge their social identities. And social identities are not like one or either. There's a lot of intersectionality in this. So how can these intersectionalities support each other and support others as well? So that's another part of conversation which I think which is missing from our many venues, including medical education as well. And the third thing I want to say before I stop talking is there's a paucity, and again I'm talking from Muslim perspective and medical education, there's a paucity of leadership in medical education context. I think Ruhina was sitting here, I'm sorry I'm calling you out here, but Ruhina was saying she's the only Muslim faculty in the Department of Occupational Therapy and Rehab. I'm the only Muslim faculty in my leadership group in the Department of Medicine. And Department of Medicine is one of the biggest departments in U of T. We have like 1,500 faculty members, 1,200 learners, but in the leadership table, on that 60 leaders of the Department of Medicine, I'm the only maybe openly identifiable Muslim, if that's the correct term as well. So there's a paucity of leadership. There's always strength in numbers. So we need to support our own peers and our own learners so that they can pursue their dreams, they can pursue their dreams and come their careers and come to the leadership table so that we can do bigger changes at whatever, whether it's law or it's other kind of journalism or it's medical education as well. So maybe I'm a half glass full kind of a person, but I personally think that all of our experiences, speaking for myself, that purposefully involving in activities which forward the commitment to equity and social accountability at a personal individual level, so that I can, if I'm holding myself individually accountable for something, I can hold my department accountable, I can hold my university accountable as well. So a bit of role modeling as well. And by involving these kind of activities, we can address discrimination, racism, oppression, and microaggression as well. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank the organizers, in particular Professor Hashmi, for the opportunity to speak. I want to talk about a story of a case that I was involved in, and I'm going to try to do it quickly. It's a story about an imam, a mosque, and a university. It's also a story about the failure of liberal institutions to take Islamophobia seriously, even while they're saying they take equity, diversity, and inclusion seriously. It's a story about the toleration of a culture of incitement against Muslims and the lethal breaking points. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's also a story about a convenient scapegoat, a false target who was held up, but who was so easy to abandon, so easy to let be made to play the villain, because the cost of standing up for the truth would be far too great for anybody individually to bear, and collectively is too much for a community under pressure and under attack to effectively mobilize collectively. And so I think it's an indictment not only of the broader society and of Islamophobia, but of Muslim communities themselves and Muslims, individual Muslims who have gotten ahead in the new economy of EDI on the backs of other Muslims. I want to set the context as quickly as possible. So 2015, we had a decisive election. Canadian Muslims mobilized like never before. They turned out at a rate of 8 out of 10 to the election in circumstances where the average Canadian voting rate is somewhere in the 60%. It was high that election on the whole, but it was especially high amongst Muslims. And Muslims felt some ownership in the unseating of nearly a decade of what was perceived as hyper-hostile governance from Ottawa and the Conservative Party and Prime Minister Stephen Harper. 10 Muslims were added to the Liberal caucus. This was an exciting day. There was an energy, a jubilant energy in Ottawa. It was unmistakable. And the first year saw lots of happy vibes. Within that first year, a young female Pakistan-born first-time backbench MP, Iqra Khalid, came forward with a remarkable and important and pressing idea that was rooted in her concern about what she called the need to quell the increasing public climate of hate and fear. And what she was introducing was M103, which was a motion that called on the government to condemn Islamophobia and to study the problem, and to develop an approach to dealing with it. She had no idea how prescient her words would be just 6 weeks later, when a gunman walked into a mosque in Quebec City and did exactly what was Khalid's worst nightmare, and frankly, probably many Muslims in Canada's worst nightmare. He shot up a mosque and killed a number of people. It was actually the most lethal attack on a place of worship in modern Canadian history. And what experts told us is that his influencers were not obscure underground hate sites online, but rather well-known media figures, people like Richard Spencer, Alex Jones, Donald Trump, mostly right-wing conservative political commentators and actors in the United States. After the mosque massacre, the Liberal government redoubled its commitments to fighting Islamophobia. There appeared a moment, just a very brief moment, when the nation seemed to come together in uniting against Islamophobia. But this would wane and morph into something far more sinister, far too quickly, in my opinion. Very, very soon we started to see opposition. Conservative columnists like Barbara Kay published pieces that questioned the need to combat Islamophobia at all, arguing that there were more hate crimes against other communities. She said Jews were more victimized by hate than Muslims, and questioned the validity of what M103 was doing, and more importantly, worried about this being a Trojan horse for Sharia creep and other nefarious developments. The Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA, the most influential Israel lobby group in the country, came out full-throated against M103. Its CEO, Shimon Fogel, testified that this term, Islamophobia, is a lightning rod for controversy, that there were elements, in his words, quote, elements or manifestations of Islam that are not only antithetical to Canadian values, but have been the basis of hatred towards and attacks on Jewish communities around the world. While he didn't use the words terrorists or anti-Semites, everybody knew what he was talking about. M103 was debated in the House on February 15th, 2017. During the debate, Member Khalid read out loud some of the demeaning tweets that she'd been subjected to, disgusting, racist, sexist communication. Largely because of that, as the climate was rising, the vote was put off by a month. In the days and weeks that would follow, demonstrations would sprout up in cities across the country. A large protest was held in Ottawa. Resistance to M103 continued to swell. Violence was reported. Discrimination, hate speech was reported. Muslims were suddenly feeling under the spotlight in an uncomfortable way. And then on Friday, February the 17th, just 2 days after the House debate of M103, something quite remarkable happened. This was just 2 weeks after the attack on the Quebec City Mosque. And that is a picket on a prominent downtown Toronto mosque, Masjid Toronto, took place. You have something like 2,000 worshippers passing through that mosque's doors each Friday. It sits right next to the central bus station, right across the street, ironically, from the Human Rights Commission of Ontario. And you had half a dozen protesters with placards calling these worshippers terrorists, jihadists, suicide bombers, rapists, pedophiles, and more. Members of the far-right pro-Israel group, Never Again Canada, posted photos of the picket to their Facebook page, and the post stated, quote, "No to M103, no to wife beating, and no to child marriage. We will never be silenced. Stop Sharia, it's a crime in Canada." A 2019 investigation in the Toronto Star would later find ties between Never Again and the Jewish Defense League, which was a well-known violent extremist organization. Passers-by in front of the mosque were disgusted by the picket, and they were quoted in the media expressing sympathy for the Muslims. And I think this is really important, because when we look at what then happened the next day, what we see is a concerted attempt in a sort of dark media site to disrupt and undermine that goodwill that had been marshaled towards the congregants at this mosque. An article, the first in a series of articles, was posted to a site that nobody knew called CIJ News, not a reputable media site. The article was titled, quote, "Supplications at Masjid Toronto Mosque. Slay them one by one and spare not one of them." That's the title of the newspaper article. The article claimed to be presenting a different side to Masjid Toronto. Watch out, it warned, this mosque is a hotbed for violent extremism. The article's author, Jonathan Halevi, took material from the mosque's website and translated it himself. And he gave it a particularly vicious spin. In fact, this guy, upon researching him a little bit further, one can discover he's a well-known right-wing media figure. He's a rebel news blogger. He's formerly an Israeli military general. He speaks Arabic fluently. He held the position of head of the Palestinian research branch of the Israeli military, and so on. These mistranslations of the imam's supplications from a prayer that was delivered 8 months before it was translated and posted in this article were picked up by the broader media, and before long it was all over. CBC was picking up the story, the mainstream media, and it was repeating that quote, "Slay them one by one." And the implication was that Masjid Toronto was propagating anti-Semitism, was calling for violence against Jews, it was calling for genocide. A few days later, not surprisingly, on February the 21st, Michael Mostyn, the CEO of B'nai B'rith Canada, which is an aggressive pro-Israel advocacy group, wrote to Ryerson University President Mohammed Lashami, who had just come into the office just 3 months earlier, reminding him of all of the issues that Ryerson had had over the previous 3 months regarding anti-Semitism, and demanding action on what Mostyn called the imam who led the falsely translated supplication, because that imam also was a full-time PhD student at what was then called Ryerson University. And he was a part-time teaching assistant in their engineering program. And according to B'nai B'rith, how could this individual who had been praying for the death of Jews possibly continue to teach in a university classroom? Lashami, who has self-identified publicly as a practicing Muslim, as someone who was born in Algeria, presumably fluent in Arabic, found himself in a particularly unique pickle. Mostyn's letter accused him of not doing enough to take anti-Semitism seriously. It described al-Kasrawi as another in a series of incidents, and it demanded that Lashami take action. I'm going to jump forward and simply tell you Lashami took action under relentless pressure by B'nai B'rith. He terminated the imam, and nobody stood up for him. Not the mosque where he was employed, not any members of the establishment Muslim community, not the Canadian Council of Imams, who had provided him with an accurate translation of his supplication well before the incident, and which he actually brought to present to the university on the day that he was fired. But the university, perhaps not surprisingly, though entirely disappointingly, was not interested in the truth. It was interested in managing a public relations problem. And you have the irony of a Muslim president of a university making a decision that was dictated by an outside organization to terminate this individual because they didn't like his words, which were in fact not even his words. And that the same university president then made a public statement describing the imam's prayer as anti-Semitic and committing to continue to fight anti-Semitism. This could have been the end of the story, but it wasn't, and that's because the imam had some support, not from within the Muslim community, but from amongst some close allies, and he got himself a good lawyer and proceeded to encourage the Toronto Star to investigate. And the Toronto Star, 8 months later, published a story that blew the lid open on the false translation, consulted 5 experts, including Dr. Hashemi, who all confirmed that this imam had been terribly maligned in the media and deserved an apology, deserved his job back. But the university refused to even acknowledge the existence of the Toronto Star story. 5,000 words, a cover page story in a weekend edition, and the university simply ignored it. And so the case continues to litigation. I bring it to your attention and to this conversation to talk about, talk about, as I said at the outset, the dangers of feeling comfortable in the development of bureaucratic practices that claim to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion when political interests lay at the heart, and when we need people in positions of power to maintain courage to make decisions based on truth. So with that, I'll invite questions, and I'm happy to talk more about the case.